Good morning, church. It is good to be together. I want to welcome you this morning to New Beginnings. Let me invite you to stand as we take some time to acknowledge the King of Kings. And I don't know, maybe music isn't your favorite thing. Maybe you have another way where you really try to respond to God in worship. But God calls us all to just engage our hearts. And so that might not be singing. I get it. That's okay. But as long as we are here and engaging with the lyrics that we're singing about our God, how good He is, how faithful He is, and that He is truly worthy of our praise this morning. So let's sing out to Him and let's worship Him with our hearts this morning. We're not going to let anybody else sing in our place. So let's lift our voices up. Not gonna wait for the walls to fall, 'cause I know a name that will bring them down. I got a praise waking within my soul. I'm not ashamed to declare it now. Sing the light of the world, the light of the world, trample the darkness. Oh, nothing can stop it. You are the God of the promise, and every word will be accomplished. Amen. Would you pray with me? God, as we gather together in this place this morning, what a beautiful day you've created that we get to enjoy and that we get just to, God, catch a glimpse of your amazing beauty. And God, as we worship, as we sing these words, God, I pray that we would just let them sink in as we declare these truths. God, that you are the light of the world, that you have stepped in, that you have, God, sent your Son to give his life in our place. And God, that we can only stand here this morning knowing the truth and knowing the life that we have because of your Son, Jesus Christ. And so, God, as we think about that, as we think about that you have loved us first, God, I pray that we would just respond to that love, that we would just pour out our thankfulness this morning, that we would just, God, engage our hearts so that we can experience what you have for us. And we know this life isn't going to be easy, that not everything is just going to be perfect here on this earth, but we know that you are coming to restore your perfection here someday. And so, God, as we seek to live in you, help us to just, God, keep you first in all that we do, that we would trust you, that we would follow after you. So, God, we love you and we worship you this morning. We do it in Jesus' name. We're doing this new series about talking faith, being able to just live out the faith that we have in our lives, knowing the truth of who our God is. And this song just kind of makes some of those statements about who our God is, about what he has accomplished, what he's continuing to accomplish on our behalf. So let's sing these words together. I believe you gave sight to the blind. I believe that the dead came to life. I believe there were wonders and signs. You're still the same. I believe every word that you said. I believe there are scars in your hands, that your goodness is good without end. You'll never change. Oh, I will tell of your wonders, sing of your grace. The God of creation knows me by name. The Lord is faithful, yesterday, now, and always. After age, and all generations will bow down and praise. The Lord is faithful, yesterday, now, and always, always. I believe you will come in the cloud. I believe you are here even now. In your presence, I know there is power to save. Oh, I will tell of your wonders, sing of your grace. The God of creation knows me by name. The Lord is faithful, yesterday, now, and always. Oh, your mercy is mighty, age after age. All generations will bow down and praise. The Lord is faithful, yesterday, now, and always, always. And you are, you always will be God. Oh, you are, and you always will be God. Yes, you always will be God. I age after age. All generations will bow down and praise the Lord is faithful, yesterday, now, and always. Always. You were, oh, you are, you always will be God. Oh, you were, you are, you always will be God. Yes, you always will be God. Your mercy is mighty, age after age, and all generations will bow down and praise. The Lord is faithful, yesterday, now, and always. Man, I hope you believe that this morning. Let me invite you to just bow your head for a minute this morning. You know, we all come into this place with different challenges in our life. Maybe some things that we just need to trust God with. This morning, I just want to give us a minute as we stand here together in this place, as we sing to our God, as we worship Him, that we would truly believe that He is the King of Kings, that He is almighty, that He is all-knowing, that there's nothing in our lives that He's not aware of. And this morning, maybe you just need to say those words, that He is the faithful God. And as much as we might not think that He is here with us or right next to us, that we can know the truth of His Scripture. So let's just take a minute this morning. Where is it that you need to know that God is faithful in your life? He's going to provide. Maybe there's a struggle or a challenge that you just haven't given over to Him. You haven't let go of that little part of your life. You want to keep that for yourself. Let's just lay that before Him this morning. Your mercy is mighty, age after age, and all generations will bow down and praise. The Lord is faithful, yesterday, now, and always. Amen, amen. As we continue this morning, I invite you to take a minute. Just give somebody a nice, warm, New Beginnings welcome before you sit down this morning. Say hello to somebody across the room. As you're finding your seats, we're going to invite the kids to head out to their class. And if you're unsure where to go or don't know where to take your kids, if you just head to the back of the auditorium, there's somebody back there who'd be happy to help answer any questions and guide and direct you as you're trying to figure out where to send them.
You're sanctifying us when beyond our understanding. You're teaching us to trust, for your plans are still to prosper. You've not forgotten us. You're with us in the fire and the flood. You're faithful forever. You're perfect in love. You are sovereign over us. You are wisdom unimagined. Who could understand your ways? Reigning high above the heavens, reaching down in endless grace. Oh, you're the lifter of the lowly, compassionate and kind. You surround and you uphold me, and your promises are my delight. Your plans are still to prosper. You've not forgotten us. You're with us in the fire and the flood. You're faithful forever. You're perfect in love. You are sovereign over. Your plans are still to prosper. You've not forgotten us. You're with us in the fire and the flood. You're faithful forever. You're perfect in You've not forgotten us. You're with us in the fire and the flood. You're faithful forever. You're perfect in love. You are sovereign over us. Let's sing that chorus one more time. Your plans are still to prosper. You've not forgotten us. You're with us in the fire and the flood. You're faithful forever. You're perfect in love. You are sovereign over us. You're faithful forever. You're perfect in love. You are sovereign over us. Pray with me. God, we thank you so much that your plans for us are for us to prosper, that you are for us and not against us. You are faithful forever. Help us to remember the things that you've done for us. We are so blessed. God, we ask that as Pastor Curtis comes to share with us this morning, that you would open our hearts and our minds. God, that we would hear from you what it is you want to speak to us today. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. You may be seated.
Well, good morning. So I feel totally called out by Brant during that one song because full disclosure, I'm exhausted. And when I get exhausted, I have a little issue with anxiety that pops up. And so my mind likes to run and it likes to go down all these different rabbit trails and all these different what ifs. And this morning on the drive in, I kept going over in what I did in the devotional, and the verse that just kept coming to mind was cast all your cares on him. And it was like God kept saying, hello, it's all your cares. Today is a day of rest. It means you can rest in me. And then Brant gets up there and starts talking about some of you are carrying stuff. I'm like, oh, shut up, Brant. But I'm exhausted this week because, we just got back from a week-long event down at Whitehall Camp and Conference Center. It's our annual gathering for the Western Pennsylvania Church of God. There's about 60-plus churches that gather and get together, and it's a wonderful time. There's worship, there's teaching, there's conferences during the day. There's all these different events that happen for the youth at night, and it's a really great week, although it's exhausting because I was chasing my kids all week and trying to figure it out. But we wanted to point out this group here because this group, it's made up of our family ministry team, Pastor Angie, our two coordinators, Chelsea and Addie, and our two interns, Anna and Paige. And about 5 weeks ago, they heard that there wasn't going to be a children's program for any of the kids down there because nobody had stepped up. And so this group, right after the 4th of July, started to do another project. And they took on leading this kids program, and they took a bunch of youth, and there were some other adults from our church that helped. And so they ended up leading a children's program every day for 200 plus kids, and they did an awesome job. And so I love to see when the church sacrifices and serves to help the larger group. And so it's encouraging to see that. It's encouraging to see all the teens that stepped up. And when you see the adults, if they are struggling to stay awake, offer to get them a cup of coffee. It was a long week of not only wrangling the kids, but then they had to deal with the youth that were down there as well all week long. And so, but it was a really good group, and the teens that were there were amazing. But we're in this series that we've been doing that's called Talking Faith. And we're really looking at what does it look like to have genuine conversations about our faith. What does it look like to be able to talk about what we believe and why we believe? Last week we talked about a verse from 1 Peter 3:15 that said, always be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have. And it was really kind of the verse that got me thinking about this whole series is, are we ready to give an answer for the hope that we have? But the problem is when you talk about faith and when you talk about these things, there's sometimes a deeply personal issue. It's something that's at our core. When you talk about things that you believe in, things that you are trying to guide your life by, it becomes very personal. When you get into these conversations, it doesn't always go well. Have any of you guys ever had a conversation with somebody about a difficult topic and you didn't enjoy the conversation? You know, you were uncomfortable, like 6 of you. The rest of you, you're going, I'm uncomfortable right now. Don't make me put my hand up. You know, when we get into those situations and we get into those uncomfortable conversations, what happens a lot of times is there's this psychological factor that happens where the front of our brain, the logical part of our brain, it just kind of shuts off. It's like what they call flipping your lid, and it just shuts off. And what happens is we start reacting out of the primal instinct part of us. We get into those conversations and we have 4 different ways of dealing with those difficult conversations. We either fight, we fly, we freeze, or we fawn. And so, you know, the idea is you get into those conversations, and for those of you who are fighters, you're like, I'm going down swinging and I don't care what damage is done on the way down. You are going to take people out and you're going to come out the victor no matter the collateral damage. You know, and so that's how some of you start responding. Some of you might be like me and you like the idea of flying. That's the kind of people that they can identify the closest exit. And if there isn't one, we make one. And then we spend the next 5 weeks avoiding that person at all costs, right? You know, you see them in the store and you duck behind another aisle. You know, suddenly you're in the baby section. I haven't had babies in years, but I'm walking down through the diapers because I'm trying to avoid them. You fly. Some of you guys, you're the type that they call fawn. It's where your reaction when you get into those conversations is that you're just going to agree with whatever they say in order to make the conversation stop. You're just going to give them whatever they want. You're going to tell them how wonderful they are and how right they are and whatever it takes because you just want the conversation to end. And some of you might be freeze, which is like the possum, okay? You're just going to play dead. And you're going to make it uncomfortable till they walk away. You just really uncomfortable eye contact, you know. Eventually they'll leave because they don't know what's going on. But part of what we have to deal with in having genuine conversations of faith is how do we get past going back to those primal instincts? How do we respond? What is the attitude that we are supposed to have while we have these conversations? How are we supposed to interact with people? Peter actually was addressing this when he wrote to the church in chapter 3, verse 15, and he said that you're supposed to always be ready to have an answer for the hope that you have, to tell anybody the answer for the hope that you have. He prefaces that a few verses before by talking about how do we actually get the proper attitude to have that conversation. What is required on the front end in order to be ready to give the answer when it is time? And so as he's writing to this church, and he's writing in the 60s to 62, where the culture is kind of antagonistic towards the Christianity that is being practiced, and it's becoming more difficult. People are becoming more threatening to the people that are following after Jesus, that are pursuing this life. And he's writing to them, and in chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, he prefaces this whole idea of being ready to give an answer by saying, okay, we have to get our attitude right. And so he says, finally, all of you should be of one mind. Sympathize with each other. Love each other as brothers and sisters. Be tenderhearted and keep a humble attitude. So far I'm reading this and I'm sitting there going, yeah, right. Have you met people? Okay? But he's saying this is the attitude we need to develop. He says, don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. That is what God has called you to do, and he will grant you his blessing. He's saying what we have to do is we have to get the right attitude. And he says, remember the thing that Jesus talked about. And he's alluding to a passage from Matthew chapter 5, verse 8, where Jesus is on this hillside and he's teaching all these people about what it is to be in the kingdom of God and what it looks like to be a person who is living in this kingdom. And he's talking to them and he says, don't repay evil with evil. He talks about this idea of turning the other cheek, of being a person that is not trying to get involved in all of that chaos and all that fighting. And Peter says, do you guys remember what Jesus taught you? Do you remember what he said? Don't repay evil with evil. He said, I want to take it one step further because sometimes we like to write qualifiers and we say, okay, I won't repay an evil action with an evil action. And he goes, no, it applies to your words as well. He says, when they insult you, don't insult them back. Don't get caught up in this petty fight. You know, and sometimes when we read this, as I was reading it this last week, there was this old statement that I used to hear when I was growing up that sometimes I have to remember and I have to turn to. That statement of, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all, right? That's kind of like a go-to. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And that's almost what he's hitting at, but instead he changes it just slightly and he says, if you don't have anything nice to say, find something nice to say. He says, don't get involved in the insults, but instead return it with a blessing. Don't get into the insults and the curses. We are going to be a people that live differently. We are going to have a different attitude when it comes to interacting with this culture. And so he says, before you even get to answering the question, you have to get the right attitude to where you don't get pulled into the fight and the argument and the insults, but instead we return it with a blessing. But my favorite thing that I read this past week that it was one of those that it changed the way that I read this verse. Because it goes on and he says, this is what God has called you to do and he will grant you his blessing. I used to read that as, okay, so if I do what I'm being asked to do, then God blesses me. But I was thinking about it this past week and I said, no, he's actually the one providing the blessing that I give. That is what God has called you to do. It's not coming up with my own strength and my own power. He's saying we are going to return these curses with blessings and it's going to be God's blessing that comes through you to the people. He says we have to get this part right before we can answer the question of why we have hope. And for us as the people that are living in the church and we're trying to figure out how do we do this now, these verses to me ring so true in our current era. These verses ring so true about how we interact with the people around us. And sometimes as we go through this world, there's this fight of, well, do we just love them or do we speak the truth? And it seems like these things are polar opposites and we have to walk this tightrope where we're going down the middle and we're saying, okay, we got to get it right. And so it's got to be so much percentage of this and so much percentage of this. It's a balancing act where we're trying to do just enough love and just enough truth that we're walking. And I don't think that's at all what they had intended for us. See, I think throughout the entire Bible, and especially in the New Testament, you see time and time again that they say, you need to get your attitude right first before you have the conversation. And then the conversation will be a reflection of the attitude. The conversation will flow out of that attitude, out of that perspective. And so I was thinking about it this past week, and there was a passage that came to mind, and it's in 1 Corinthians. And so we're going to look at this section from 1 Corinthians, a letter that was written by Paul. Paul wrote to the church in Corinthians. The church in Corinth, as you read this letter reads like a parent scolding a child. As Paul is writing, he's like, you're doing this, stop it. Do this instead. You're doing this, stop it. Do this instead. And so it's this letter where he's constantly correcting them because what has happened is this church in Corinth has gotten to a place where they have taken this whole idea of Jesus and they're starting to press into it, but they're using it to mistreat other people around them. They're using it to play favorites. They're using it to play all of this different things to where they're not treating people the way that God intended them to be treated. They're not remembering the reason why Jesus came in the first place. And so Paul is writing to them and he's trying to explain to them about what it is to be a group of people that are following after Jesus, that are passionately in love with Jesus, and how that affects how we interact with everyone around us. And so what happens is we get to this chapter in chapter 13, and it's this famous chapter that sometimes is quoted at different weddings and different events, but we have to think of it in light of the chapter that comes right before. Because right before chapter 13 is chapter 12, where Paul is going on and he's talking to them about how God has pulled all of us together to work together as a group. And it's not about one of us being greater than the other and how we're all supposed to be carrying each other's weight. And he uses this image of a body and how God has designed and crafted this body. And he says we're all part of this one body working together to accomplish God's goal. And he's explaining to them that a foot, if you cut off a foot from the body, it's not going to thrive by itself. Feet weren't meant to live apart from the body. But he also says, but the body wasn't meant to not have feet. He says they each need each other. They're each for mutual encouragement. They each work together to accomplish what God is doing. And so he says we have to understand that this is the bigger picture of what God has called us to do. And he said, but before we can even get into just experiencing these entire gifts, he says we need to get our attitude correct. And so he shifts gears in chapter 13 and says, let's address the attitude with which we express these gifts. And so he starts in 1 Corinthians 13:1 saying, if I could speak all of the languages of earth and of angels, but I didn't love others, I would be only a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I had the gift of prophecy and if I understood all of God's secret plans and possessed all knowledge, if I had such faith that I could move mountains but didn't love others, I would be nothing. If I gave everything I had to the poor and even sacrificed my body, I could boast about it. But if I didn't love others, I have gained nothing. Paul looks at him and says, get the proper perspective before we go any further. He says, if I could have all these amazing things, but I forget about love, it doesn't matter. The first verse, the image that he uses, he's saying, if I could speak in the tongues of men and angels, if I could speak with all the knowledge of earth and all the knowledge of heaven, and I knew everything and I was articulate and nobody could debate with me because I always won and it was amazing, but if I forgot that I'm supposed to love others, he said, I'm just a noisy gong, a clanging cymbal. How many of you would love to have a conversation with a cymbal? Okay? How many of you have ever gone to a high school football game and sat in front of the band, specifically the percussion section? Yeah, we don't do it. It's not a pleasant place to sit. We love percussion. It's important to the music. But if you're sitting there right in front of the cymbal and it's just going in your ear, it's annoying. Have you guys ever come across somebody that sounds like a cymbal? How many of you have ever scrolled through Facebook or through Instagram or through Twitter and there's a person on your friend list that is just a noisy gong, right? Do you guys have those people? Are you those people? They're the person that when you're going down through, you see their name and you instantly just keep scrolling. You don't even stop to see what they're saying because it's just noise. Why is it noise? Because the attitude isn't there. Because the proper attitude isn't there. And so they could have everything perfect and have everything worded great and have a phenomenal argument and all of these great ideas and all these great expectations. But if they come across as not loving anybody, we don't care. It amounts to nothing. It means nothing. And so Paul looks at this church and he says, we need to remember the foundation of what Jesus came here to do, of who we are following. He says we can have it all put together. We can have the faith that we can just look at a mountain and move a mountain. We could have all of this amazing stuff. We could be the most gifted, skilled person in the world. But if we forget why Jesus came, it means nothing. He goes on and he starts giving all these different explanations of what love is. It's patient, it's kind. It doesn't keep a record of wrongs. It's long-suffering. all these different ideas. And at the end, he says, and at the end of the age, when everything is faded away, when all the stuff is done, he says at the end, all these other things that we tend to hold up, that we tend to cling to, they don't matter. It doesn't matter how many debates we've won. It doesn't matter how many arguments we had. It doesn't matter how many trophies we've won. It doesn't matter any of that stuff. He says at the end, there's only going to be 3 things that remain, and that's faith, hope, and love. And there's one that wraps it all together. He says the greatest of these is love. Why does he go back to that one? Because that's what Jesus focused on. When Jesus was teaching his disciples and he's training them and he's teaching them all the different things that God has commanded, he had to go back and he had to remind them time and time again about the fact that love is essential, because we have this human nature that makes selfishness our primary directive. And he's saying, you got to put that to death and put on God's love, because God is love. And so he goes on and he tells them all these different things, and he's explaining to them all these different ideas of what it looks like to love. And he tells the disciples in John chapter 13, I think it is, he's going on and he's telling them, the world's going to look at you and they're going to know you're my follower. How are they going to know you're my follower? I think we forget this verse. We think of a lot of different things. Well, they're going to know that we're his followers because of what we're against, or what we're for, or what we stand by, or, where we go on a Sunday. He said, no. They're going to know you because of your love. Because it's so drastically different than what they experience in this broken world. That is what's going to make them come up to you and say, why do you have the hope that you have? Why can you be who you are? I mean, even when they asked Jesus to take and combine and condense all of the Old Testament, and they said, what is the greatest commandment? He comes to him and he says, there's one commandment, and this is what everything else hinges on. If you don't get this one right, the rest don't matter. And he says, it's to love God and to love your neighbor. He says, we've got to start there, or the rest of it doesn't matter. He says they can all be summed up in that. They all hinge on this idea. And of course, we as people, we always look for the loophole, right? And so the crowd that was listening to him said, okay, yeah, but who is our neighbor? Okay, let's define this. Who is it that we actually have to love? And there's this famous parable that Jesus tells about the Good Samaritan. That's what it's called in our Bible. You'll read the Good Samaritan. And it's because we see this story of this guy who sacrifices his energy and his time and his care to take care of this person that was beat up alongside the road. And you see all these other people pass by, but there's this one guy that was good and he did it. And we read it and we go, oh, that's so great. That's a warm fuzzy. What we don't realize is in that day and age, as he's looking out at this crowd and they say, who is our neighbor? He says, I'm going to pick for you the most despicable person that you can think of. I'm going to pick for you your greatest enemy, the one that you want to write off the quickest, the one that irritates you the most. That is your neighbor. And so he says, when I talk about loving your neighbor, that's who I'm talking about. That's what it looks like. And so Paul looks at it and he says, church, Corinth, before we go anywhere, before we do anything else, we have to get the attitude right. He wrote another letter to another church in Ephesians, and this letter is a little bit different because this letter was written to a church that it's not so much a scolding parent, but it's a person coming alongside saying, you're doing this, awesome, keep doing it. You're doing this, awesome, keep doing it. It was a letter of encouragement, but it was also a letter that was written while Paul was in prison in Rome, and he didn't know if he was going to see the next day or the next day. And so it's like he's trying to get out his last words of encouragement to this church, his last statement, so that they can go and they can carry on. And he's writing to this church, and he comes across the same exact idea that he came across in Corinth. Why? Because it doesn't matter what you're going through. This is foundational. This is a principle that applies to the people who are doing it wrong and the people who are doing it right. He says, if we're going to be in the kingdom, if we're going to be in the body, we have to get this right. We have to get this attitude right. And so in Ephesians chapter 4, he gets to this place, and he says, therefore, I, a prisoner for serving the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of your calling. Underline that phrase. He's looking at him saying, this could be the last thing I ever say to you, my last, greatest, final wish. I implore you, I beg you, I plead for you. He's saying, if I could see anything or if I could ask for anything, what I ask is that you lead a life worthy of your calling. That the answer for the hope that we have is impacting the way that we live. That the two match. Because Paul has understood that the greatest detriment to the church being able to have these genuine conversations about faith is when our lives don't match our answer. When the two are on separate planes, it doesn't make any sense. It's the biggest block in being able to have a genuine conversation about faith. And so he says, my prayer, my plea, my final request for you, live a life worthy of your calling. He says, for you have been called by God. What does that look like? Always be humble, be gentle, be patient with each other, making allowances for each other's faults because of your love. Making allowances. That's, some of the translations say forbear. There's a bunch of different words that go in there, but it made me sit back and wonder, what does it look like to make allowances? And it reminded me of a book that I read several years ago. This book was called Crucial Conversations, and it talks about how to have these difficult conversations, because like I said, when my lid flips, I run. And so I wanted to get better at figuring out, how do I keep my brain engaged? How do I do these conversations well? And so as I was reading this book about crucial conversations, it's talking about this idea that when people come and we get into these difficult conversations, there's often a unknown or unexpected story that runs in the background. He says, we tell ourselves a story based on the other people's actions or statements. I mean, think about this in your life. If somebody does something that you don't care for, what happens in the back of your mind? There's an instant story that starts to run, right? So-and-so didn't show up to a party that you were planning. They never show up to the party I'm planning. It's because they're out to get me. It's because they have a vendetta against me. It's because of this. It's because of this. And we start running down this rabbit trail where we tell ourselves a story to justify the final outcome. And we work backwards. We start with what happened and we work our way back until we're so upset that we can't even function. What the book encourages us to do is tell ourselves a different story. So many times I have to remind myself when I get into those situations, when something irritates me, when I'm in a difficult conversation, that I have to tell myself a different story. They didn't show up to the party because they had a really long day at work. It did not go well at work. They were frustrated. They came home. They decided to take a nap because when you're depressed, hey, sleep helps. They took a nap. They overslept. It wasn't intentional. It had nothing to do with me at all. My perspective on that person is going to change based on the story that I tell. And so Paul, writing to this church, says, if we are truly loving each other, let's make allowances. Let's tell ourselves a different story. Let's realize that we're all fallen, we're all broken, we're all in this journey of moving towards God. And so we give people the benefit of the doubt. And we tell ourselves a different story. Make every effort to keep yourselves united in the Spirit, binding yourselves together with peace. Why do we keep ourselves united? Because there is one body, one Spirit, just as you have been called to one glorious hope for the future. There is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, in all, and living through all. If you have to, underline every single place where it says one. Circle it, whatever it is. When somebody's repeating something, it's important. And he's saying, why do we do this? Because there is one. One body, one group, one issue, one God, one Jesus, one Spirit. He says, we are in it together. He says, we do this and we step into this life of love because we are following after the God who is love. He goes on from that point in Ephesians and he starts talking about how God has placed different gifts. Sounds very similar to 1 Corinthians, right? God has done different gifts and he's given people different abilities and they all work together in this body that was created, one body that's working together. And he gets to this point where he says, so when you get the right attitude and when you get the body working the way that it's supposed to work and everything is firing on all the cylinders, what happens? You get to verse 14 and he says, then, when all of this is working together, then you will no longer be like immature children. You won't be tossed or blown about by every wind of new teaching. You will not be influenced when people try to trick us with lies so clever they sound like the truth. Paul's looking at that and he's saying, remember how the enemy works. Because the enemy doesn't tell you something that sounds wrong. Because we'll stop and we'll go, well, that's wrong. He tells you something that is so close to being true that we think it is. Go back and read Genesis 3 and you'll see the snake show up in the garden and he goes to Eve and he introduces just this little bit of doubt. Did God really say? Did he really say that? And then he tells you something that is so close to being true. When you eat the fruit, you will be like God. And that's how he tricks us. And yet Paul is saying that when you have this attitude of love, when there is love for the people that you are with around, the people in the body, the people outside of the body, when that is happening, when you are pressing into the gifts of the body and allowing the body to encourage each other, what happens is we're not going to be pulled and swayed. James talks about the same idea about being tossed by waves, back and forth, being caught up in every new teaching. We're not going to be pulled aside by that because we're going to have love as a foundation that's going to pull us into truth because Jesus is love, but Jesus also said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so as we press into that proper attitude, we experience truth in a whole new way. And so he goes on to say, instead of being tossed back and forth, instead of listening to those lies, what happens? We speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of the body, the church, who makes the body fit together perfectly. And as each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts to grow so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. See, what Paul gets to here, and what we see time and time again through the Bible, is that it is not a percentage of it's this much love and this much truth, and we have to walk this balancing act. What they all say is that when you actually press into love, press into God, get the proper attitude, the natural byproduct is truth. And so when somebody says, I'm going to give you the truth and love as like a statement to preface what they're about to say, that's normally a false statement, okay? If you have to give a preface for them to believe it, it's not believable. Live a life worthy of the calling so that you don't even have to say it because you are exuding love and they know that what comes out of that love is the truth. They're not two different issues. They are one and the same, two sides of the same coin. That you can't really love somebody without telling them the truth. And you can't really tell them the truth without first loving them. And so what we have to understand is if we're going to have these genuine conversations, before we get to the place of even getting the answer for the hope that we have to love the people in a way that they are going to want to ask the question. We have to love each other in a way that they're going to say, why do you guys act the way you do? What gives you the hope that you have? Why is this life so different from what we see in the world? Because out of that love comes the truth. And we're able to have these genuine conversations that God has called us to be a part of. I'm going to ask the ushers to come forward at this time for our morning offering. If you guys will pray with me. God, I am so grateful that you sent your Son to be an example for us of what it means to be a person who loves people, and out of that love comes the truth. That you wrapped love in flesh, that you wrapped your grace and your mercy and your kindness, and you came and you lived here on this world to reconcile creation back to yourself, to fix the things that we broke. Because your love was so extravagant. Your mercy so amazing. God, I pray that you would help us as we continue to worship you through our gifts, through our tithes, as we give back to you, that you would help us to worship you in that you would help us to worship you in our singing, that you would help us to worship you as we leave this building, that we too could live out Paul's dream for the church in Ephesus, that we would live a life worthy of the calling that we have. So that when people look at us, they want to ask why we have the hope that we have. And when they do, God, we will be ready to give them an answer. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amazing love that welcomes me, the kindness of mercy that bought with blood wholeheartedly my soul undeserving. God, you're so good. God, you're so good. God, you're so good. You're Lord, I will remember what Calvary has bought for me, both now and forever. God, you're so good. God, you're so good. God, you're so good. You're so good to me. And God, you're so good. God, you're so good. Oh God, you're so good. You're so good to me. Sing that again. Oh God, you're so good. Oh God, you're so good. Yes, you are. Oh God, you're so good. You're so good to me. I am blessed. I am blessed. I am called. I am healed. I am whole. I am saved in Jesus' name. Highly favored, anointed, filled with your power for the glory of Jesus' name. Sing, God, you are so good. God, you're so good. Sing it out, church. You're so good. God, you're so good. You're so
Amen. Isn't that a great way to end the service? You can have a seat for just a moment. There's a couple things that are in your bulletin that I just want to bring to your attention. The first one is that next weekend we'll be having a baptism at the pond. So that's July 30th, and it'll follow our second service, so it'll be noon. If you're interested in being baptized, you can go onto our website, and under events, you can register there. You can sign up online on your Connect card, or you can call the church office, and we'll help you with that. Then coming up, August 20th, we have church at the fair. So we'll be going over to the Crawford County Fairgrounds, 9 a.m., gate 6. And I'd say plan to bring a friend. Bring a friend. It's an awesome time being together. I know Pastor Curtis complains about the sawdust there and the metal chairs, and it's really uncomfortable, but it is fun. So just disregard him. Yeah. I'm going to be reprimanded tomorrow. And something that isn't in your bulletin, just want to mention it. We did this, we had a kickoff for this in the spring. We had a new platform of giving. And so if you would like me, I have to have notes for everything. I don't have a note for giving anymore because I just let it do it automatically, and I love it. So if you want to do that, you don't need a little yellow note to remind you to give, and you want to do that online, go to our website. There's a place that says giving, and it'll walk you right through. If you need a little bit of help with that, I can help you. My extension is 335, and I'd be glad to help you with that. I wrote this down because when we were singing that last song, when we leave here, We do not go in our own power. We go in the power of Jesus. And so as you leave this place, go in the power of Jesus, loving in his truth. Have a great week.